Today, on a special edition of Brian Ross Investigates, bracing for the worst as COVID-19 hits America's prisons and jails.
COVID-19 is spreading fast inside the jail.
It's going to be a mass grave site up in these prisons.
Activists and celebrities calling for the early release of non-violent offenders. We'll be joined by Amanda Knox, the American student who spent 4 years in an Italian prison before being exonerated for the murder of her roommate.
Every day in prison, I feared getting sick.
Plus, your questions about COVID-19 and the law, your job, your home, your rights.
We'd like to know what rights we have.
What do you suggest we do?
From the Law&Crime Network, this is a special COVID-19 edition of Brian Ross Investigates. Welcome and thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Ross, and this is a special report from the Law&Crime Network and for our viewers on Facebook Live and YouTube Live. And I'm joined this afternoon by Rhonda Schwartz, investigative reporter and executive producer of this program. And Rhonda, we're talking about hotspots around the country, and one of them, it turns out, are America's prisons and jails.
That's right, Brian. And just like the tragedies we saw in nursing homes all across the country, prisons also have the potential to be death traps. We already have thousands of prisoners who've tested positive for the virus. There have been dozens of deaths around the country, so much so that federal and state officials are now moving to early release of non-violent inmates. It's a problem that's growing that needs to be addressed.
Indeed, and finally, it's getting the attention it really does deserve. Here's some of the stories we saw across the country this week.
This is a dormitory. We stupid crowded, we super crowded.
COVID-19 is spreading fast inside the jail.
It's going to be a mass grave site up in these prisons.
Over 2,600 inmates and almost 3,000 staff members of prisons and jails nationwide have now contracted COVID-19.
We need help.
Desperate pleas from behind bars.
Death is imminent for us.
Prisoners in the Alabama correctional system fearing for their lives as the coronavirus pandemic spreads.
Shocking attack inside Cook County Jail. 2 guards knocked unconscious, one of them dragged into an inmate's cell.
Chicago's Cook County Jail releasing over 1,300 inmates to prevent the spread of COVID-19. The facility is a coronavirus hotspot.
3 people have already died from the coronavirus at the Cook County Prison, and there are more than 500 cases of coronavirus inside the facilities. The public defender says up to 90% of detainees in the Cook County Jail are considered innocent. They are pre-trial, and they are being released with the public safety in mind.
So, Rhonda, we're getting lots of questions already from our viewers about this issue. And joining us to talk about that is Erin Haney. She's the policy director for the Reform Alliance, a group that advocates for better prison and sentencing policies. And Bruce Barquette, a lawyer in New York who is a criminal defense lawyer and knows a lot about this. Let me start with you, Erin. One of the questions from our viewers just in, what are jails doing for prisoners who are testing positive with the virus?
It's a great question. So one of the most difficult things right now about our jails and prisons is that they really aren't set up to deal with any type of health crisis, let alone a viral pandemic. So when we think of jails, we think of non-porous surfaces like metal, which we know can hold on to the virus for longer. We think of significant overcrowding. We think of places where it is literally physically impossible for people to social distance. And given what we know about the virus, it means that even a low-level jail sentence can be quickly transformed into a death sentence. And so we've been working with jails across the country who have been instituting policies to really try their hardest to bring the CDC recommendations into the jails under those challenging conditions. And mainly what that looks like is it means taking into consideration the corona pandemic when setting bail. So making sure that we are only incarcerating people on essential arrests, making sure that our jails aren't full of people who are in there for technical violations like non-crimes. And also shutting down visiting, which can be very, very hard on the mental health of people inside, but is necessary to protect both the correctional officers and the people inside, providing hand sanitizer, hand soap, masks, as well as some free medical care and free video and phone visitation, given that in-contact visitation has been shut down.
Okay, thank you, Aaron. Bruce, a question for you from one of our viewers. If prisoners are released, are they then on parole, or do they have to go back in after the pandemic passes?
Well, that all depends on the conditions under which they are incarcerated. If they are pre-trial, in other words, they haven't been tried or convicted yet, they very well may be released, and assuming they behave themselves when released, there's no reason to put them back in. If they're convicted prisoners or convicted individuals, those people are being released and sent home, period. A few instances in state court I know of where they've been released temporarily with the idea that they might have to go back and serve out the remainder of their sentence after the pandemic alleviates itself.
All right. Aaron, a question for you from Rhonda Schwartz.
Aaron, why should the community at large really care about this issue beyond folks who have inmates and relatives in prison? Why should the rest of the community really care about this?
It's a great question. What happens in prison really doesn't stay in prison, especially during a pandemic. Safer prisons and safer jails really do mean safer communities during this pandemic. So even if you aren't somebody who has a grandparent or a child who's behind bars, all of these recommendations make our correctional officers safer. They make our communities safer. We have to think about when there's an outbreak behind bars, which we know now spreads much, much faster than outbreaks in the community. They overwhelm not just the people behind bars and not just the correctional officers and the staff, but also local hospitals. So nurses, medical equipment, medical supplies, all of the ventilators that we've heard that are in such short supply. An outbreak in the prison and in a jail really affects all of those things. So it very much impacts the rest of the community as well.
Bruce, a question for you. Are people who are violent offenders being released because of this?
I've seen a few violent offenders be released at the end of their sentence. In other words, if they don't have that much more time to go and they've served the majority of their sentence, I've seen that happen. I have also seen a few alleged violent offenders pre-trial being released under fairly strict conditions. Even for violent felony offenders and individuals who have committed what we all would consider bad crimes, the sentence that they've been imposed upon them has not been death. It hasn't been death by virus. So if we have a situation where if you keep somebody in because of either their physical condition or the conditions of the jail, and they're likely to get this virus and die, they ought to be released, even if they're serving time for a violent offense.
Let me ask you this, Aaron, a question that one of our viewers is saying. Be sure to ask about the guards, the workers in the prison. They're just as exposed, aren't they?
Absolutely. It's such a good point. When we've seen these epidemics and these outbreaks in our jails and our prisons, what we've seen by and large is that they impact the correctional officers and the correctional staff just as much, and in some cases even more. And what happens is that as correctional officers are going in and out of the prisons and the jails, they're also then taking the virus home to their community, to their families. We've heard just heartbreaking stories from correctional officers who tell us that they are absolutely petrified to go home because they know that the virus is spreading in their place of employment, in the prisons and jails, and they are terrified to take it home to their families.
So that's a real problem then, because they're just as exposed, really.
Absolutely. They are.
If you're just joining us, you're watching us. If you're just joining us, you're watching a special report from the Law&Crime Network and for our viewers on Facebook Live and YouTube Live, talking with the issue of prisoners and prison guards exposed to the COVID-19 virus. Someone who's been advocating for the release of prisoners and for better conditions is someone who knows a lot about that. Amanda Knox, the former American student who spent 4 years behind bars in Italy before being exonerated for the murder of her roommate. I talked with her earlier.
Oh my gosh, I'm devastated by what's going on right now. People are sent to prison, rightfully and wrongfully every day, but like even when someone is rightfully imprisoned, they are not being sentenced to sickness and disease and fear and uncertainty, the likes that we are seeing right now during the pandemic. It's very scary.
What do you think should happen?
Wow. I think that we really need to rethink what incarceration is for. And we need to look at the kinds of people who are very, very high risk and pose minimal threat to society and release them. Like it's that simple. The prisons don't need to be as full as they are. And we are holding way too many people in prisons as it is.
Right, we've over-incarcerated, that's for sure, especially with the prisoners in their 70s and 80s. Does that make any sense at all to you?
No, they don't pose a threat to society. The only reason to hold them in prison is to punish them and make them suffer. And right now, that people lose their time, and that is the punishment. They don't need to also be under threat of losing their lives. That is not a part of their sentence.
Let me ask you, how are you doing? And is it possible that what you went through, as horrible as it was, there's a silver lining to that?
I consider myself incredibly fortunate. And every day in prison, I feared getting sick. At the very least, I felt like my body is trapped, but I am not trapped inside of a sick body inside of this place. And my worst nightmare would be to get sick in prison, because already to live a life that was worth living was hard enough, but to have to fight for care inside of that environment terrified me. So, I've been speaking to a lot of other formerly incarcerated people during this time of quarantine, people who have gone through breast cancer treatments and who have had to have knee surgery, and the fights that they have had to do to get that kind of treatment scares me to death. And I can't imagine how scary it is for people who are incarcerated right now. And it feels cruel to me to put people through that kind of fear.
Amanda Knox, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And Aaron Haney, let me ask you, Amanda is a very prominent person. A number of celebrities have also stepped forward. Is that a helpful thing, you think, to put focus on that from people who have such prominence?
Absolutely. This movement is led by and should be led by people who are directly impacted. So people who have had their own experiences, whether it's behind bars or as law enforcement, or whether you've had a family member and a loved one who's locked up. But it's also incredibly important to use, influential folks who have these massive platforms to really get the word out and really help people understand the gravity of the situation that we're dealing with right now behind bars.
And you yourself have a very prominent legal intern working with you on this issue, don't you?
Yes, we do. So we work with Kim Kardashian, who has been just one of the most incredible advocates on criminal justice in general, specifically around unjust sentences, conditions of confinement, and clemency. She has just been a really, really incredible advocate working alongside people who have been directly impacted and who are leading this movement.
And your group also has put together some powerful videos of relatives of people who are behind bars talking about this issue. Let's look at this.
My husband is currently incarcerated for a first-time, non-violent offense. He is only 38 years old, but he does suffer from many medical conditions. He is listed in the BOP as a chronic care inmate for his severe epilepsy and for his severe hypertension. While any one of his seizures could kill him at any time, the risk of contracting the coronavirus in his medical state means for a fact that he will not survive it. And like thousands of other inmates, if they were to contract the coronavirus, they would not survive it either, meaning that With every day that passes, they are living while running the risk of having a death sentence.
So, Bruce Barquette, let me ask you a question of our viewers. Who decides who gets released? You've been working on it yourself for some of your clients, I take it?
Yes, no, absolutely. We have worked on it for a number of our clients, and it depends on the situation. Like almost all answers in the law, it depends. So there are different categories of people. People in the federal system, in pre-trial, the trial judge who's supervising their case can make a decision to release them on bail. If they've been sentenced, they can go to a federal, they have technically supposed to go to the Bureau of Prisons first, but many federal judges have waived that requirement, and a federal judge can release them on compassionate release. In state court, it varies as well. Pre-trial, the trial judge. Post-trial, you have to go back to the sentencing judge, at least in New York, to try to get them to re-sentence the individual. And we've had some limited success in that regard. And of course, in every state and in the federal system, the executive can issue clemency to individuals who are in this situation. And I think the executives, the governors and President Trump have been slow to do that, to use this power. They ought to be looking at this. They ought to have a committee set up, looking at individuals in prison that are at real risk and simply releasing them. It should not have to be a monumental task going through the courts, fighting with prosecutors every step of the way. There ought to be a streamlined process for this. We have all these other systems set up in place to deal with the unique situation of this pandemic. We ought to have something to deal with prisoners who, again, haven't been sentenced to death and haven't been sentenced to suffer a virus in prison. There's no reason to keep these individuals locked up.
Thanks, Bruce. Aaron, a question for you from Rhonda Schwartz.
Aaron, so what is the state? Amanda spoke about her fear of getting sick in an Italian prison. And what if you do get sick in prison? What is the state of health care if you're in that unfortunate position? What can the prisoners expect?
Great question. And as Bruce said, it really depends, unfortunately. So it depends on your facility, on what state you're in. But I think that we can say, by and large, unfortunately, if you are incarcerated, the chance that you will be receiving quality care is low. There are limited resources. There are limited doctors. We've heard reports of facilities with a single doctor, and that doctor has been out sick with COVID. And so we are really talking about people who have very little access to quality care, if any care at all. And so Amanda's fears, which she so passionately described, are things that we are hearing every day. We got a call just the other day from somebody inside saying that there was no medical care, that they were getting written up for trying to wear masks to protect themselves. And that they were calling because they just wanted to make sure that if we didn't hear from them, we knew it was because they had passed away. And what they told us was that there was a line of people all the way back down the hallway, all calling their attorneys, their family members, and their advocates to say the exact same thing. And you really get this feeling of like this idea that people are in a plane that is going down and they know it's going to crash, and they are reaching out in any way that they can out of desperation to let people know that they're there and they need help that they aren't getting. And sadly, that is really what is happening right now with the lack of access to medical care during this pandemic behind bars.
Bruce Barquette, getting a lot of questions from relatives of people who have friends and family at the Coleman Camp for Women in Florida, federal facility, that the warden's being difficult and putting a high bar to have the release of prisoners who otherwise might qualify. Is there any recourse for those inmates or for their relatives legally?
Yeah, yes, they can go to court. That is the avenue for most of these individuals that are being detained and at risk of getting the virus and at risk of dying, is they need to get lawyers or organizations to go to court for them and get judges to overrule wardens and order the release. There was just a case reported out of New York where a retired police officer was in for a nonviolent crime, and he was supposed to get released, but the federal prison I think it's in South Carolina, ordered him on a 14-day quarantine before his release. And the 14, as the judge put it, the 14 days was neither 14 days nor quarantine. He was put in with other prisoners that might have the virus, and she ordered his immediate release. You can't depend upon the wardens. You can't depend upon, frankly, those that are guarding these individuals to supervise their release. They're not in a position to do it, and they're not objective, and they frankly don't have the wherewithal and the understanding to do it. You need to go to court, get these judges to order the release. It takes time, but right now that's the best route.
Okay. Aaron, a question from one of our viewers. Aren't the prisoners actually safer if they're inside a prison than out in the public?
This is one of the most dangerous misconceptions about people behind bars, is this idea that they are somehow already quarantined. And as Bruce just mentioned, you know, in the case he was talking about, even when they actually do quarantine people inside of prisons, they are rarely actually quarantines. Sadly, prisons and jails are the most unsafe places that you can be during a pandemic. And that's due to the overcrowding. So it is physically impossible to socially distance. There is usually a lack of sanitizer and cleaning supplies that are necessary to prevent the spread of the virus. There's often a scarcity of hot water and soap. There is, you know, usually inadequate medical care, as we discussed. And then on top of all of that, there are just some basic challenges behind bars in terms of maintaining some of the basic CDC recommendations. And so really what you end up having is the most dangerous sort of hotbed situation for the coronavirus to spread.
Okay, Aaron Haney, I want to thank you so much for joining us from the Reform Alliance. And Bruce Marquette in New York, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll be back here on Thursday. Tomorrow, Jesse Weber will answer your questions about ongoing trials, what's happening. For now, this is Brian Ross on behalf of Rhonda Schwartz. Thanks for joining us on the Law and Crime Network. Stay safe and have a very good day.